Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video here at the NCN Hockey channel. Today we have a few things to discuss, including a couple of signings, some injury updates, as a lot of players seem to be getting a lot more healthy right now, and some trade rumors involving the San Jose Sharks, the Nashville Predators, and could a couple of key defensemen end up bringing in first-round picks to their current teams at the trade deadline. We'll get to all of that coming up right now. Hello, and welcome to another video here at the NCN Hockey channel. I'll kick things off today with discussing a few signings that have happened over the last few days. I'll start with St. Louis, as the St. Louis Blues have extended young goalie Joel Hofer on a 2-year contract extension that will have a cap hit of $775,000. Now, Hofer has done really well in the AHL over the past few years, and Hofer does look like he could be an NHL starter in a couple of years' time. Last year, he had a decent season in the AHL, playing majority of the season in the American Hockey League, putting up 2.96 goals against average and a .905 save percentage in 35 games. And he did actually get into 2 NHL games with the St. Louis Blues last year when they were having a little bit of injury trouble with guys like Binnington and Husso. And he did alright. He didn't look like he was ready for an NHL opportunity at that point. He got into 2 games and had a 3.07 goals against average and an 80 save percentage. So he didn't do really good, but he did do okay in the AHL. He looked like a couple more years of development he could eventually get to the NHL. And he has done a lot better this year in the AHL than he did last year. He has currently played 22 games this year in the AHL and has some pretty good stats, putting up a 2.39 goals against average and a .922 save percentage. And he's done really good. So it looks like Hofer could easily be a backup, if not a starter eventually, for the St. Louis Blues. The Blues' current backup in Thomas Greiss only having this year left on his contract, it does seem like Hofer will probably be the Blues' backup starting next year. And with him being signed for this year and then 2 more seasons now at $775,000, that could easily be a good steal for the Blues, for at least a backup goalie. So definitely a good signing for the Blues to extend Hofer. I do think that if the Blues were to move on from Binnington in a couple of years' time, Hofer could easily be the starter for the Blues. So getting Hofer to be the backup starting next year is probably a smart move for the Blues, as they would have a really cheap backup. And I think after this year, Hofer should be ready for a big role in the NHL. So definitely a good extension for the Blues to get Hofer locked up for the next few years. And hopefully Hofer can continue to grow, as he's done really well in the AHL this year. He's probably going to be a backup for them next year, and hopefully in a few years he can be either a tandem goalie or possibly a starter for the St. Louis Blues. And over in Tampa, the Tampa Bay Lightning have signed Nick Perbix to a 2-year contract extension. They'll have an average annual value of $1.125 million. Now, Perbix came out of nowhere. A lot of people did not know his name before this year. They've mostly been playing in college for the last couple of seasons. He finished up his college career last year, signed his entry-level contract with the Bolts late last season, and got into a couple of AHL games last year, putting up 2 goals and 8 points in 12 games in the AHL to end the season. And he started the season in the AHL this year, as the Bolts do have a pretty deep blue line. But after a couple games in the AHL, he was called up to the NHL, and he has done really well this year, putting up 3 goals and 8 points in 30 games this year, and has been a mainstay in a top 4 role with guys like Sergachev, Hedman, and Chernak. So he looks like he's a really good player. He's a 4th-round pick from a couple of years ago, and he looks like he could be easily a really good top 4 defenseman. He's still on the younger side, and this is his first NHL season. But if he can continue to grow off of this year, he's going to be a really good steal for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, the Lightning did lose McDonough in the offseason, who had played some top 4 minutes for the Bolts, so it was a big loss. That's why they brought in guys like Ekholm and Hayden Fleury, and Perbix has really just taken that top 4 spot and run with it. So he's done really well on basically a second pair line with Sergachev for the majority of the year, and it looks like he can be a really good defenseman for the Lightning. So he could even put up some points, as he's shown this year, and if he can continue to grow, I could easily see him be like a 20 to 30 point defenseman in a couple of years' time. So getting him signed to a cheap, just over $1 million contract for the next few years, after he's shown that he can be a good NHL defenseman this year, is good. And I think that the Bolts could easily have themselves a steal of a deal in a year or two's time. So definitely good to get Perbix signed. He seems like a good piece of this Bolts blue line going forward, and getting him locked up is a big piece for the Tampa Bay Lightning. So good to see Perbix and Hofer get extensions, as Perbix to start his NHL career and looks to take a next step forward, and Hofer looks to start his NHL career next year. But that's all the signings I want to get to today. So now over to the injury updates part of the video. We'll start over in Carolina, as there have been some bad and really good news on the injury front for them. Now, Stefan Noesen left one of the Carolina Hurricanes' most recent games and is now going to be out for an unknown period of time with a lower body injury. Now, Noesen is a good depth forward. He was mostly in the AHL last year, but he did enough in the AHL last year to earn a call-up this year, and has mostly been playing in a bottom six role this year with the Carolina Hurricanes. He has occasionally gone up into the top six, but for the most part, he's been playing in a bottom six role, and he's been really good. He's a good fourth, third line forward who won't put up much points, but he's a good penalty killer and can really be a good grinder for the Carolina Hurricanes. So definitely think that losing him for the next few games is not going to be good. He's out for an unknown period of time, so it's really hard to pinpoint when he could be back. But definitely do think that Noesen being out is not an ideal situation for the Hurricanes. And then the good news that they had is that Max Pacioretty has been activated off of long-term injury reserve and could be getting into one of the next two games for the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, Pacioretty had surgery just before training camp started, and he was probably going to be out for about 6 months. So that timeline put him at around early February. So it looks like he is going to be a bit ahead of schedule, and he's going to make his debut probably in the next game or two for the Carolina Hurricanes. And that's huge. Pacioretty was acquired in the offseason from Vegas for nothing, so he was basically a free pickup because Vegas couldn't retain him due to their cap problems. And he had not gone into any games with the Hurricanes as of yet, so getting him back at this point will allow him to get some chemistry with some of the Kings players, like maybe a Teravainen or Jarvis, well before they go to the playoffs, as they look like cup contenders right now. And adding Pacioretty to that lineup is going to make them even more lethal. Now, with their lineup, I could usually see him being placed on either the second or third line for the Carolina Hurricanes, and he should be able to continue to be a really good goal scorer, like he was showed with Vegas. So definitely think that getting Pacioretty back for the Kings is huge, and he should be able to be a driving force as soon as he steps on the ice for the Hurricanes. Now over to Philadelphia, as they had a couple of activations recently. They activated Bobby Brink off of season opening injury reserve and Carter Hart off of injury reserve. Now for Brink, he had not played at all this year due to a off-season surgery, and he had spent the entire season on season opening injury reserve, and he has now been activated. Now, Brink is a pretty good prospect. He got into a handful of games last year after finishing up his college career, and he looked pretty good. He was a former second-round pick, so definitely think that Brink should get into some NHL action. He was sent to the minors, so he's probably going to spend a little bit in the minors. But with Philadelphia being one of those teams who are probably going to be sellers at the deadline and most likely not making the playoffs, I do expect Brink to probably make the jump to the NHL in the probably next couple weeks. I think Brink's a really good prospect. He should be a good top six forward in the next year or two for the Philadelphia Flyers. And I think if he was healthy to start the season, he probably would have made the roster right from the get-go. So definitely think that Brink getting healthy is good. He's probably going to play a few games in the AHL, get called back up to the NHL, and probably show that he can be a good top 9 forward at least at this point in time. As for Hart, he was placed on injury reserve just before the Christmas break, and the Flyers had to use goalies Sandstrom and Urson for a couple of games, and now he's back. So getting Hart back's good. Hart's shown at the beginning of this year that he can easily be the Flyers' starting goaltender for the foreseeable future, as he was stellar in the earlier part of the season. He has slipped a little bit, but that's because the team started to play, like a lot of people have thought, really poorly this year. But he still looks like a really good starting goaltender, and he should still be a good starting goaltender for the next few years. And he's definitely, at this point in time, a better goaltender than either Sandstrom or Urson. So definitely getting Hart back is a huge win for the Philadelphia Flyers, and I do think that getting him back into the lineup will help this Flyers team be a little bit more stronger defensively for the foreseeable future. As for the Toronto Maple Leafs, they got two key defensemen back over the past week and a half. So about a week ago, the Toronto Maple Leafs activated Morgan Rielly off of long-term injury reserve, and he was able to get back into game action. He had been out since about mid-November with his injury and was given a timeline of 6 weeks, so right around the time when everyone had expected him to be back. But Leafs have done pretty well without some of their key guys in the lineup, guys like Rielly, Sandin, Muzzin. They've done really well defensively, even though they haven't had those top guys in. So definitely think that getting Rielly back is huge. Also, Rasmus Sandin, He was activated just a couple of days ago, and he's going to be back into game action now. Sandin's a really, really good second, third pair of defensemen right now, who's probably a top four defenseman in the future. He's done really well, especially with guys like Riley and Muzzin out when those guys were injured, and getting him back is also pretty good. So getting Riley Sandin back is going to give this team a huge boost defensively. They should be able to continue to play really strong defensive game. They still have a guy like Jake Muzzin injured right now, and Victor Mete, and they now have guys like Jordy Ben and Connor Timmins scratched. So they're definitely getting a lot more healthier on the blue line, and with Sandin and Riley getting back, this team is going to be even more lethal than they have already shown earlier this year. Over in Vegas, they've had good and bad news on the injury front. Now, Daniil Miromanov, who was called up due to a couple of injuries on the blue line a little while ago, and Alex Martinez, who's a consistent top four defenseman for the Vegas Golden Knights, are both out right now. Martinez is on IR, Miromanov's just an unhealthy scratch, but Miromanov has a lower body injury, and Martinez has an undisclosed injury, and they're both going to be out for an unknown period of time. Now, that's a big blow to the Vegas Golden Knights blue line. The Knights still have Shea Theodore out due to an injury, and while they have gotten Alex Pietrangelo back, Miromanov was showing that he can easily be a good third, second pair of defenseman if need be for the Golden Knights, and losing him and Martinez, who's a really good top four defenseman, is awful news. I think with Martinez and Miromanov out, Miromanov being like the eighth defenseman on that team, they have to run with guys like Pacioretty and Korzak, who are mostly right now AHL players on the third or second pair. So really banged up blue line right now for Vegas with guys like Whitecloud and Theodore and now Martinez and Miromanov out. And hopefully this defense can continue to push through right now with their banged up blue line, as they're still in a really good playoff spot right now, and they need to keep on winning games as teams like LA and Seattle are starting to catch up to them. So Vegas needs wins, and losing guys like Martinez and Miromanov is not going to help them. But on the flip side, they were able to activate Jack Eichel, and he should be able to get into game action in the next game or two. Eichel's a really good top-line center for the Vegas Golden Knights. He's shown that he can put up points after last year's surgery that he had, and he's shown that he can still be a really good driving force in the NHL. Now, the Knights have definitely missed Eichel. They're also really banged up in the forward group right now, with other guys like Marchessault, Cotter, and Howden injured right now. So definitely getting Eichel back is a huge win for the Vegas Golden Knights. Eichel should just go slot right back into the top line and be a good top-line center for the Vegas Golden Knights. And I think Eichel back, that top six is going to get a huge boost for the Vegas Golden Knights. So definitely a huge win for Vegas to get Eichel back. But the injuries continue to come with guys like Martinez and Miromanov now being injured as well. Over in Detroit, they have had a huge activation, as forward Robbie Fabry has been activated off injury reserve and gone into his first game action of the season last night. Now, Fabry had missed a lot of time, actually since the end of last year with an injury. He was injured late last season with the injury and was going to miss the rest of last season. He also missed training camp and the offseason, and he's missed the first part of this year. So getting him back is huge. Fabry has shown over the past couple years, ever since being acquired by the Red Wings, that he's a good middle six forward. It can really help this Red Wings team offensively. I know that the Red Wings have had a lot of offensive bodies this year, but getting Fabry back is huge. And after a few games, you should be able to get into the third or second line and be able to produce really well with some of the other guys that are there. And it also sounds like Tyler Bertuzzi might be close to a return as well with the Detroit Red Wings. So Red Wings are starting to get a little bit healthier. They're still slightly in the playoff race. They're a few points out, but I think if they were to go on a run and one of those teams in a wildcard spot were to start losing a couple of games, they could get themselves back into a playoff race. So definitely going to be interesting, but acting Robbie Fabry is going to be a huge boost for the Red Wings offense. And last year with the Washington Capitals, they've also had a few activations, as they activated Beck Malenstein off of injury reserve, they activated Martin Feravari off of injury reserve, and they got TJ Oshie back from injury. Now, Malenstein has missed the last couple of months with the injury, and getting him back is huge. Now, with the Caps already getting a little bit more healthier right now, and still being in a playoff spot, whereas when Malenstein was up, they were really banged up. They don't really need Mallenstein right now, so they moved into the AHL. I think that's a smart move. Mallenstein is more of an AHL player, but he can be a good depth piece if they ran into more injuries. So getting him back is good, and I do think that he could end up being called up if they run into a couple more injuries. Oshie was only out for a couple of games, just as an unhealthy scratch, but getting him back is huge. He's a good third-line forward. He's not the player he once was. I don't think he can put up the point totals that he did in the past couple of years. But Oshie's still a really good third-line center/winger, and he can easily play anywhere in the middle six. So getting a good veteran like that back is good. And then over with Martin Fehervary, he's a good top four defenseman for the Capitals. He's really done well with a guy like John Carlson over the past few years on the top pair, and he looks like he could be a really good fit for the Washington Capitals. So definitely think that getting Fehervary back is huge. And there's also some talk that Tom Wilson and Nicholas Backstrom, who have both missed the entirety of the season due to injuries, and it did sound like Wilson would be out until early December with his injury, and Backstrom possibly the entire season. It does sound like both of them are close to return. For Backstrom, it would be quite surprising, as most people did expect him to be out for the entirety of the season. As for Wilson, he was probably expected to be back just before the Christmas break, so a couple of weeks later isn't too surprising. But definitely getting Wilson and Backstrom back in the near future could be huge for the Washington Capitals, as those were the two main guys injured when they started the season. So getting Backstrom and Wilson back hopefully in the next couple of weeks is going to be huge for the Capitals, but activating Mallenstein and Fehervary and getting Oshie back into the lineup is huge, as the Capitals team is still in a playoff spot and they're getting healthier, so they could be a difficult team to push out of a playoff spot. Now that's all the injury updates I want to talk about. Now let's go over to the trade rumor part of the video. Start with the San Jose Sharks, as Ryan Merkley, a good young prospect for the San Jose Sharks, has asked for a trade, and the San Jose Sharks have made him available to teams. Merkley is an okay defenseman. He has mostly played in the AHL since being drafted in the first round a couple of years ago, I think in the 2018 draft. Merkley played a couple of years over in juniors before going to the AHL, and he's played a few seasons in the AHL now. Last year, he had a goal and 19 points in 30 AHL games, and did pretty well, but he also got into 39 AHL games, putting up 1 goal and 6 points. So he showed some of his potential last year, being a good second pair defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. But the San Jose Sharks reworked their blue line a bit, adding guys like Scott Harrington and Matt Benning. And Merkley just fell down the depth charts and has been basically staying in the AHL this year for the entirety of the year. So far, he just has 14 assists in 30 games. So he hasn't done as good as he did last year. Definitely was a little bit more productive in the AHL last year and gone to a lot of NHL games. And seems like he's a little bit frustrated with his handling in San Jose, as he's not an NHL defenseman right now. So he definitely wants a little bit of a fresh start away from the San Jose Sharks. And I definitely think the Sharks could easily get it. I mean, Merkley's probably not going to cost much for a team to acquire. Maybe a 3rd or 4th round pick for acquiring Ryan Merkley. He's not the first round talent he was a little while ago, but he could still easily be a 3rd pair defenseman in my opinion. On the right team, I could see him being a good 3rd pair defenseman, maybe even putting up some points. So I definitely think that the disgruntled prospect in Merkley could easily find a home elsewhere, and I do think that the Sharks will probably end up trading him, whether it be now or probably in the off-season when his contract expires and he's going to become an RFA and he'll need to re-sign. So I definitely think Merkley is a guy who we should watch over the next couple of weeks leading up to trade line, and maybe in the off-season if nothing happens before the trade line. And I definitely think Merkley will probably move for like a 3rd, 4th round pick and to a team where he has an easier shot at making the NHL roster, and hopefully he can show that he's still a good possible offensive defenseman in the NHL and be a good 3rd pair, maybe even 2nd pair player. Over in Nashville, there are a few reports that the Nashville Predators have made Matthias Ekholm available and are willing to move the defenseman before the trade deadline. Now, the Predators didn't have the best of starts this year. They got themselves back up to around 500 and have been sitting around 500 for the majority of the season. They're right around 500 right now, I think, as well. But they're pretty far out of a playoff spot, and they're not doing overly fantastic. So there's a lot of talk that the Preds could wind up being sellers at the deadline, and I think that's a possibility. The Preds have been playoff teams over the past few years, but they've been barely making it in. I mean, if you look at 2 years ago, they started off absolutely horribly, and they had to claw their way back up the standings, and they just made 4th in the division in those realigned divisions in the shortened season to make the playoffs. Last year, they were the 8th and final team in the Western Conference to make the playoffs, just ahead of got teams like the Golden Knights, Canucks, and Jets. So the Preds have been making the playoffs, but they've been barely making the playoffs as the last team. So definitely think that the Preds could wind up selling a few pieces before the deadline. There's a couple of guys. I know they said Ekholm's one. Ekholm was in the first year of a 4-year, $6.25 million deal. So it would be definitely difficult to move a guy like Mattias Ekholm. I don't think the Predators would want to retain much salary on Ekholm if they were to move him. But he doesn't have any trade protection, so it wouldn't be too difficult to move him because they wouldn't need to ask Ekholm where he would be okay to go. But it definitely would be difficult to get an Ekholm deal done. If you look at the Preds roster, there's not really much that they could trade. You have Forsberg, Josi, and Saros are probably all not going to be traded if they were to be sellers at the deadline. You're probably not going to move Ryan McDonagh because he has no movement clause. No one's going to want the Ryan Johansson or Matt Duchene contracts right now. And Mikael Granlund has been one of their better forwards, so I don't think they're going to trade him. Really, the most likely scenarios I could see being traded are mostly defensemen. I could see Dante Fabro being traded. He has not done overly well this year. So has Alex Carrier. Both right-shot defensemen did really well last year. Carrier had 30 points as a rookie, but both have not done really well this year. And Fabro's even been scratched in the last few games. So Nashville's blue line could definitely use some tinkering, I think. They still have a good core, but I do think maybe switching up some things would be good for the Nashville Predators. And I also think that they could also move a guy like Colton Sissons maybe on the forward group, or maybe a Nino Niederreiter. But there's definitely a few options if the Predators will be sellers. But it does sound like Mattias Ekholm at the very least could be possibly dealt before a trade line. And Ekholm and the Predators are definitely something we should keep our eye on before the trade line. But I'd like to know what you think. Do you think Nashville ends up being sellers at the deadline? And if so, who do you think gets moved? And lastly here, on the most recent insider trading on TSN, they talked about how a couple of players, including Vladislav Gavrikov and Joel Edmundson, could bring in first-round picks for the current NHL teams. Now, the Montreal Canadiens and Columbus Blue Jackets have not done overly well this year and could be looking to move some guys at the trade deadline. And Gavrikov and Edmundson are possible options. Now, it does sound like even though this is a really deep draft and a lot of people will want to keep their draft capital, some teams might be willing to part with a first-round pick for some players. And it does sound like Joel Edmundson and Vladislav Gavrikov could easily fetch a first-round pick for their teams. In Edmundson's case, the Canadiens aren't pressured to move him. He still has a year left on his contract after this year at $3.5 million. So they're not pressured to move him. So it does make sense that if the Canadiens were to move him, it would have to be a return that really blows them away. So it does sound like Edmundson could possibly, if he were to be traded this year, bring in a first-round pick. I do think that would be a little bit of a steep price to pay for a good second pair defenseman, but he hasn't really done well this year. So I do think it would be a little bit of a steep price, but the Canadiens aren't really forced to move Edmundson right now. So if a team, like we heard a little while ago with Edmonton being interested in him, were to want to acquire him, it might end up being that the price tag is the first-round pick. So definitely going to be interesting to see if Edmundson brings in a first-round pick. And then also Gavrikov, who they also said is not a guarantee to be moved, as the Jackets might want to re-sign him, even though they're not a really good team right now. But I do like how Gavrikov's played with them over the past couple of years, so retaining him is not out of the realm of possibility. But with the Jackets being on the outside looking in and possibly obtaining a first-round pick for him, it's also possible that they could end up trading him. Gavrikov sort of reminds me of the David Savard situation a few years ago. A good second, third pair defenseman who could be a really good force in the playoffs and could end up costing a team a first-round pick to acquire him. So definitely think that Edmundson and Gavrikov are two key pieces who could bring in first-round picks. A couple of other guys who I think could end up bringing first-round picks to our current team would be like a Patrick Kane of the Chicago Blackhawks, Vladimir Tarasenko of the St. Louis Blues possibly. I think Bo Horvat of the Vancouver Canucks would definitely bring in a first-round pick. Jacob Chychrun, at least one, if not possibly two first-round picks for the Arizona Coyotes. And there are probably a couple of other players who could easily bring in a first-round pick. I mean, last year, when the calendar changed to 2022, between the start of 2022 and the trade deadline in March, there were actually a couple of players who were traded for first-round picks. I mean, Toffoli was traded by the Montreal Canadiens to Calgary Flames for a first-round pick. Just before a trade deadline, the Canadiens moved Ben Chiarot to Florida for a first-round pick, a high prospect, and a fourth-round pick. The Tampa Bay Lightning acquired Brandon Hagel, who was a good young middle six forward, and a couple of fourth-round picks for middle-level prospects Boris Kachuk, Taylor Radish, and then multiple first-round picks, and one in this year's draft, one in next year's draft. The Blackhawks moved Marc-Andre Fleury to the Wild for a conditional first-round pick that ended up being a second-round pick when the conditions weren't met, so it wasn't really a first-round pick, but it could have been a first-round pick. Andrew Kopp was moved to the New York Rangers for Morgan Barron, a second-round pick, a low-end draft selection, I think it was like a fourth or a fifth, and a second-round pick that ended up changing into a first-round pick, so that was another one that ended up being a first-round pick. Also, Claude Giroux was traded to Florida, along with a couple of AHL players and a fifth-round pick, for a first-round pick, a top-end prospect in Tippett, and a fourth-round pick, so he's another guy who brought in a first-round pick. And Hampus Lindholm was dealt to Boston as well as an AHL player for Urho Vanakainen, who was a top-end prospect, a first-round pick, and then 2 second-round picks. So there were 6 players traded between the start of the new year and the deadline who ended up bringing in first-round picks to their team. 7 who had conditional possibilities as being first-round picks if you include Marc-Andre Fleury. It definitely seems that even though this is a really deep draft and there's a lot of good talent in the NHL this year, there could easily be a couple of players who are traded for first-round picks before the deadline. So that's all I'm going to talk about today. Remember to like this video and subscribe. I also do a blog, which I will leave a link to in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for next week's video. See you guys soon.